Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk about how problem behaviors such as delinquency, victimization, and bullying are embedded in school climate, what aspects of school climate are most important for understanding those behaviors, and what can be done to enhance school climate so that it serves to discourage rather than encourage those problem behaviors. So what is school climate? The idea behind school climate is that schools are more than the sum of the inhabitants in the schools. Each school has a personality of its own, and that personality influences student outcomes. Before I discuss ways in which schools might try to change their personalities, I'd like to summarize findings from school climate research conducted over the past 40 years or so, and this research has helped to establish what about school climate, what specific aspects of school climate are important contributors to problem behaviors. Recently, Phil Cook, Chongmin Na, and I undertook a review of research on school crime. We reviewed all of the studies to date that had summarized aspects of school climate and how they affected different problem behaviors. And so we summarized what was known about those specific aspects of school climate, and we concluded that these three aspects of school climate were important contributors to a variety of different problem behaviors. The student-teacher ratio, or the number of different students taught by the typical teacher, and those aspects of the way schools are organized for instruction directly influence the second aspect, which is sense of community or sense of belonging in the school. And part of that sense of community involves shared beliefs about what are acceptable behaviors in the school. And then the third aspect is consistent discipline management supporting those norms. So I'd like to just first describe some of the earlier studies that helped to establish the importance of these aspects of school climate. One of the earliest studies that began to establish the importance of school climate was the Safe Schools study. It was conducted in 1976. It involved extensive surveys of principals, teachers, and students, asking about their victimization experiences, but also asking them to report on different aspects of their school environments. We merged those school data with characteristics of the communities in which the schools were located so that we could control on those community characteristics when we were trying to isolate the effects of school environment. So that the Safe Schools study found that among the largest predictors of victimization in school, net of many important community influences, were the characteristics that are shown in this slide. First, large school size and number of different students taught by the typical teacher. And then a number of different aspects of school discipline management, things like low perceptions of firm and clear rule enforcement, the use of ambiguous sanctions in response to misbehavior, low perceptions of fairness and clarity of the rules, and so forth. So that was in the 1970s, and then about 20 years later, the Department of Education and the National Institute of Justice funded another large national study that similarly involves surveys of principals, teachers, and students, and also we also merged on information about the communities that the schools were located in. And that study again found that more sound discipline management was related to lower levels of student delinquency and student victimization, and also that positive social climate. And in this study, positive social climate was measured as clear organizational focus, high teacher morale, strong administrative leadership. So both of those were related to lower levels of victimization. And as in the Safe Schools study, these effects were found controlling for the characteristics of the communities in which the schools were located. Now, the Safe Schools study had shown that larger schools experienced more victimization. We used the national study data to see if that finding replicated and also to explore other aspects of school size. So we studied these three aspects of school size that you can see on the slide. First, the student enrollment or total number of students in the school. Second, the student-teacher ratio. And third, the number of different students taught by the typical teacher. And so we did find that higher student-to-teacher ratio and larger number of different students taught did increase student victimization as expected. But interestingly, we found that total student enrollment, total number of students in the school, was related to lower victimization rates, contrary to what the Safe School study had found. And it's interesting that that same finding, that same negative relationship has been recently replicated in another study of 300 schools in Virginia. So this suggests that it's not so much the number of students in the school, but rather the ratio of students to teachers and the way the students are organized for instruction that matters. We also found that one of the reasons why students in schools with high ratios of students to teachers experience more victimization is that in these schools there's less consensus about norms for behavior. So we see that schools that have more students per teacher might be less able to develop clear consensus that aggressive behavior or bullying behavior or so forth are not acceptable. And this lack of consensus about norms in the school is very important, and it's one aspect of school community, which I will talk about next. My colleague Allison Payne has used the National Study of Delinquency Prevention in School data to explore the effect of what she calls communal social organization. Communally organized schools are schools in which members know, care about, and support one another, have common goals and a shared sense of purpose, and actively contribute and feel personally committed. So she found, indeed, that schools that are high on this CSO do have lower levels of student delinquency. And also the effects of CSO on delinquency are mediated by student bonding. So that is in schools that have high sense of community, students are more attached to school, and that tends to restrain their delinquent behavior, their offending behavior. Allison Payne also tested to see if school climate indirectly influences problem behavior by altering the individual level processes that generate these behaviors. And she did find some evidence of these cross-level interactions. Specifically, she found that attachment and belief at the individual level, an individual's attachment and belief, have less of an effect on delinquency when those students are in high CSO schools. So, in other words, feeling less attached to teachers and schools increases delinquency less in schools that are more communally organized than in those that are not. So these results suggest that when school community is strong, individual behavior is less reliant on the individual's own personal controls. I want to just briefly mention another study that was undertaken to try to understand what factors might have led to the spate of school shootings that our country experienced in the 1990s. This study sent teams of ethnographers into 6 different communities that had experienced lethal school shootings. And those teams interviewed people about the incidents, and they collected data about what had happened during and after the incidents occurred. And there are many interesting findings from this study, but most relevant to my talk today is that they found that in all 6 of these communities, there was a large gulf between youth culture and the adults in the communities. The shooters were intensely concerned about their status and about protecting themselves. The adults in the communities had a very poor understanding of the students' experiences. The shooters felt that they had nowhere to turn, and in every case they had given specific warnings that had been missed. So I think these are important findings that speak to the school social climate, that is the extent to which the school feels like a community to the people in the schools. And these findings clearly reinforce the findings from the survey research that I summarized a little bit earlier, yet using a very different methodology. All of the research shows the importance of meaningful relationships between students and adults in schools, and shows that these relationships predict a wide range of problem behaviors. Contemporary studies are also beginning to uncover effects of these same aspects of school climate on a different form of problem behavior, and that is bullying. 2 recent studies have directly linked aspects of school climate to bullying. One of these is a study of 95 elementary schools, and it found that students in schools with higher student-to-teacher ratios reported greater frequency of bully victimization and reduced perceptions of school safety. And another recent study of 300 schools found that students in schools with high levels of perceived teacher and social support are more willing to seek help for bullying and aggressive behavior. And a different analysis of those same data showed that teacher support as well as firm and consistent discipline management are related to lower levels of bullying and other forms of victimization. So it's comforting to see that the findings of these 2 very recent studies are highly consistent with a broad set of studies dating back to the 1970s. And I think these studies taken together very clearly demonstrate that these 3 aspects of school climate are important predictors of a wide range of problem behaviors in schools. So the next question is, can these dimensions of school climate be changed? So in the 1980s, OJJDP funded tests of 16 different ideas about how to intervene in schools to reduce delinquent behavior. And 2 of the ideas that they tested were efforts to change those same aspects of school climate that we've been talking about. So I'll tell you about these 2 models, but first it's important to note that the methods used in these early studies don't meet the high standards of evidence that we require today. But the studies nevertheless provide interesting ideas, support for interesting ideas that could be revisited and tested more rigorously today. So Project Status. This was a program that reorganized schools using a schools within a school approach. It used the block scheduling to create a 2-hour block of time each day that was team taught by a small team of teachers, and these teachers had been especially trained to use more engaging teaching methods. So for at least this 2-hour period each day, students were with the same teachers, a small number of teachers and the same students, in an environment that was designed to promote a sense of belonging. So by keeping students together with a smaller number of teachers, I hope you can see that the program directly reduced the number of different students taught by the typical teacher. So this was evaluated with a randomized trial, but only in 2 schools, and it showed positive effects on crime, antisocial behavior, and substance use. Another of these early models was Project PATHE, and this model focused on changing the school organization in ways that were expected to improve students' attitudes about school. So basically, the school was reorganized into teams of staff, community members, and students, and each of those teams was responsible for planning changes to the school in a particular area. 2 of these areas were discipline policy and school climate. So the discipline policy team worked together to develop a referral system that made clear what should be the consequences for different infractions. They developed handbooks and distributed them to parents, teachers, administrators, and students. And they developed a referral system that would help to keep the enforcement of the school rules consistent. The school climate team developed a number of different activities that they implemented over the course of 2 years. These activities were mainly aimed at getting students involved, giving students meaningful roles in the school, and making them like school better. So basically, the program reorganized the way the school was managed and placed a large emphasis on discipline management and on creating a sense of belonging in the school. This study involved 9 schools that were tracked over a 2-year period, and this also showed positive effects, a reduction in crime, antisocial behavior, and substance use due to the program. Now, in addition to these vintage programs, some current efforts also focus on changing the aspects of school climate that we've been talking about. One of these is the Safe Dates programs. Many of you are probably familiar with this program. It's a dating abuse prevention program for middle and high school students. It includes a 10-session curriculum, as well as a theater production. The theater production is put on by the students in the school, and it's about how a victim of dating abuse seeks help. There's also a school-wide poster campaign. So students in the schools develop posters about dating violence. These posters are placed throughout the schools. All of the students in the school vote on the posters, and the top 3 posters are given cash prizes. So hopefully you can see that this set of activities is designed to solidify norms about against dating violence, and that's one aspect of communal social organization that we talked about. So this is a more contemporary program. It was evaluated in a randomized trial of 14 schools following students over a 4-year period. And it showed, the study showed a reduction in violence perpetration. And then finally is PBIS, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with positive behavior interventions and support. This is a contemporary program that focuses on the discipline system in the school, but it also addresses, I think, a sense of community, much in the way that Project PATHE did in the 1980s, because it creates a team of school community members who work together to improve the school over time. So that team, very similar to the work done in that PATHE program, the team establishes expectations for positive behavior, it sets up a positive reinforcement system, and it works to improve the clarity and consistency of the discipline system. a recent randomized trial of PBIS, at least the school-wide components of PBIS involving 37 elementary schools, showed that it was effective for improving the organizational health in the schools, reducing aggressive behavior and peer rejection. So we can conclude that interventions aimed at altering the school climate dimensions that we've been discussing do seem to reduce problem behavior. In the last few minutes that I have, I'd like to say a few words about security-related school-based interventions, because I think it's possible that some of these interventions influence sense of community in the school and discipline management in undesirable ways. So specifically, I want to say a few words about placing police officers in schools. The Department of Justice funding for these programs or placing police in schools increased dramatically after 1999. It was mainly in response to a sense of urgency to do something about the school crime, wave of school crime in the 1990s. And you can see from this chart that all of that increased funding led to a dramatic increase in police presence in schools. The Safe School Study data from 1975, those are the red bars in the chart, showed that principals in only 1% of the nation's schools reported that police were stationed in the school. And among senior highs, it was only 13%. By contrast, the most recent data from the School Survey on Crime and Safety, the blue bars in the chart, shows that principals in 43% of schools nationwide have police, and in senior highs, it's up to 76%. And these figures would be even higher if we focus only on city schools. So this obviously represents a major shift in the way discipline is handled in schools, and one that's likely to have pretty large effects on the level of problem behaviors experienced in the schools and also the way those problem behaviors are handled. And the effects may be positive. Proponents of the increased presence of police in schools believe that SROs enhance discipline management in schools and increase school safety, not only through their surveillance and enforcement functions, but they also believe that the police in the schools form bonds of trust with the students. So the effects may be positive, but they may also be negative. There might be unintended negative effects of this large increase of police in schools. Scholars have suggested, for example, that increased law enforcement presence in schools might erode the effectiveness of informal social control mechanisms by shifting the responsibility for maintaining order in the schools from teachers to police. And then they also talk about the possibility that increasing reliance on surveillance, enforcement, frequent searches, arrests, and so forth might create an environment of fear and distrust that would actually weaken sense of community in the schools and actually cause students to be more reluctant to confide in adults in the school when they have problems. And also there's a potential for civil liberties concerns. We've seen that in many school systems. There's been evidence that SRO programs disproportionately affect minority youth. Now, unfortunately, no studies to date have shed light on these possible mediating mechanisms. I mean, you know, what happens when police are placed in schools. But one recent study using the National the National School Survey on Crime and Safety data looked to see whether adding police to schools influenced the level of recorded crime in the school and also the percentage of those crimes that were reported to law enforcement. And that study concluded that as schools increased their use of police, they record more crimes involving weapon possession and drugs, and they report a higher percentage of their non-serious violent crimes to law enforcement. Now, of course, one plausible explanation for the apparent increase in crime when we place police officers in schools is that they're just recording the crime that occurs more accurately. So this is an unfortunate aspect of using official records to measure crime. If the police influence the way crime is measured, we can't really learn very much by using that as an outcome measure. So future studies of the effects of police officer presence on schools should use a measure of the outcome of interest that's not influenced by police presence in the school. Something like self-reports of victimization would work better. So let me just end on a hopeful note. Within the next year, the next few years, we'll probably know a lot more about school climate effects on problem behavior than we know now, because the National Institute of Justice just launched its comprehensive school safety initiative. This is a large-scale research effort that should build knowledge about what works to increase safety in schools. It was just launched last year in response to a congressional appropriation of about $75 million. And under this initiative, NIJ has already funded 24 different research projects, 9 to research organizations, and 15 to school systems that are working closely with researchers. So you can see that these awards will fund studies of a variety of approaches to reducing school crime, including efforts to improve school climate. Numbers 2 and 9 on this chart are studies that are going to look at improving school climate. And one study will look at what happens when police are added to schools, a much more rigorous study than any one that we have to date. And then one study, the top one, will actually train SROs and other school staff to implement discipline policy more consistently and fairly. So it's promising. These are the school district awards, and you can also see that many of these will focus on school climate. And one of them, the last one on the list, will even train SROs to improve the school climate. So this is indeed an exciting time for school climate research, and I'm looking forward to what's learned in the next few years. So just to wrap up, much research has led us to identify these characteristics of school climate as important predictors of a variety of problem behaviors. Several efforts have been undertaken over the years to try to improve these dimensions of school climate, but many of these studies are dated and many didn't use rigorous research methods. Some of the policies and practices in place in schools today might actually increase the risk of problem behavior by worsening these social climate conditions, but we need a great deal more research to fully understand that. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.